is that you teach from home, and things sometimes happen. Hold on just one second. This is Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Web Yeshiva with another installment in our Jews, Judaism, and Modernity series. Welcome back. Last time we discussed the rise of neo-Orthodoxy, and in fact the rise of Orthodoxy as a movement, as opposed to merely the default position around which Judaism organized itself. We talked a little bit about the Chatam Sofer, and I mentioned in passing Rav S.R. Hildesheimer during the week. I sent you a link to an interesting article, an essay online about Rav S.R. Hildesheimer. I hope some of you might have had the chance to look at that. I also sent you a very inspiring story about a Ger Tzedek, about a convert to Judaism, who's now a pious Jew learning Torah all day. In his previous life, he was a rap star or something like that, a gangster rap star, and he was drawn into exploring Judaism and making these radical life changes by encountering Rav Hirsch's commentary on the Chumash. That was really, I thought the story in and of itself was inspiring, but I thought the timing was fortuitous because we were just talking precisely about that figure and that work. And of course, here he is, Rav Hirsch, who was very much responsible for, as we described last time. And I remind you, if you missed the shir last time, you can catch the archives to fill in the blank. Rav Hirsch, 19th century Germany, very much formulates a response to the rise of Reform Judaism, but yet is sensitive to the fact that the status quo may need some updating, and is open to the idea of certain types of reform, but reform with a lowercase r, not with a capital R, in the sense of that movement. One of his great works is the 19 letters. In English, it's called the 19 letters. In the chat, at the top of the chat, let me see if I can't. Oh, where is it? Oh, yeah, here. At the top of the chat, I'll put it in again, is a link. I mentioned that there's a new translation, or a relatively new translation of the 19 letters. There's a link in the chat now. There's a relatively new translation of the 19 letters. Unfortunately, I was unable to get my hands on a copy of it, but published by Feldheim. But I just discovered earlier today that much of it is available on Google Books for free. You can't print it out, but you can see most of it online, and you can skim through it. They have introductions to each of the 19 letters, footnotes, summaries, etc. From what I understand, it's a really wonderful edition. I don't have this edition, and I was unable to get my hands on it, but here it is, and you can of course get it from Amazon or other Jewish bookstores. But most of the book seems to be online on Google Books from this link. Alan just put the link up to Feldheim, who's the publisher. I'm not sure whether the price is better directly from Feldheim or from Amazon, but you can take a look. There it is. I think the price is probably about the same. So unfortunately, we'll have to muddle through with the conventional translation, the old-fashioned translation, which was also put out by Feldheim, but quite a number of years ago. without the benefit of all of the accompanying explanatory material. Again, the 19 letters is, in short essays. We talked a little bit last time about the convention of writing a work of philosophy in the guise of these letters. The dialectical tone of a letter is certainly much more engaging than dry, straightforward philosophical writing. Each essay deals with a different topic in the philosophy of Judaism. There are 2 essays at the end of the volume that deal with the topic of reform. The work, which was Rav Shimshon Shmuel Hirsch's first published work, when he was relatively young, gained widespread attention, particularly among German youth. Of course, it's written originally in German. It's available now, of course, in translation in Hebrew, into English, and I assume many other languages as well. But it was written originally in German, and it was written aimed smack on at his target audience, and particularly at young people. There are 2 letters in the volume that deal with the topic of reform. Actually, this is the shorter of the two letters, but in some ways, because of that, it's a little more pointed. I hope that you had a chance to look through it, but I thought that we could do a close reading of the piece and make some comments, and particularly try to fit it in within the context of everything we've been talking about in the last number of weeks. So this is the letter that we have. The whole question of emancipation, affecting as it does only our material state of affairs, possesses only a subordinate interest for Judaism. Now, that in and of itself is a quite radical statement. In the post-emancipation era, Jews have been made full citizens. At least on paper, they've been given full civil rights. They're citizens equal to any German. In reality, of course, we know that it wasn't always exactly quite so simple. Passing of legislation doesn't necessarily change everything. But just think about in the United States, the civil rights movement. Passage of legislation does not abolish prejudices. It doesn't abolish the types of discriminations that can be maintained despite the letter and spirit of law, etc., etc., etc. But at least on paper, the Jews have been emancipated. It's topsy-turvy. The whole world has been turned upside down with emancipation. And here we have it. Shimshon Shmuel Hirsch says, emancipation. Well, what does emancipation do? It affects our material state of affairs. It affects our standing in the world vis-a-vis the general society. It affects our ability to work in different trades. It affects our ability to be protected against certain discriminations. But it doesn't address the spiritual realm. That's part of the nature of, obviously, they're not talking about a separation of church and state, but insofar that it deals with the Jews' relationship to the state and to the larger host society, it deals with, not with the spiritual component of life, but the material component of life. And therefore, it possesses only a subordinate, a secondary interest for Judaism, because Judaism as a system is principally concerned with the spiritual. It is indeed interested in the material, but only secondarily. Sooner or later, the nations will decide what attitude they should take on the issue between right and wrong, between humanity and inhumanity. The first awakening of a sentiment nobler than the mere lust for gain and thrills will speedily take effect in the emancipation of the oppressed everywhere, and therefore also in that of the Jews. There is, however, he points out, as we go along, if you have comments particularly relating what's written here to what we've seen before, please type up in the comments or raise your hand. I'll pass you the microphone. I'd like to hear your voice as well. There is another goal before us, the attainment of which depends entirely upon our own efforts. It is the refinement and ennoblement of ourselves, the fulfillment of Judaism by Jews. So he points out that yes, it's wonderful that we've been emancipated. It's wonderful that we've been granted civil rights and equality. However, we still have work to do. Emancipation does not solve the problems of Judaism. It may solve some of the problems of the Jew in the modern world, but it doesn't solve the problems of Judaism per se. Those problems, the refinement and ennoblement of ourselves, that's up to us. That can't be affected by the passing of any legislation. That's up to us. Judaism by Jews. Jews for Judaism. Jews for Judaism. There's been a lot of press about the passing of the founder of Jews for Jesus a couple of weeks ago. Some of it really quite insightful about the ills of that particular movement. But here, Rav S.R. Hirsch is talking about Jews for Judaism. This leads to a consideration of the topic which you designate by the term reform. Now again, the letters, we're presented with the response of Rav S.R. Hirsch to his interlocutor. We have to intuit what it was that the question was about, to which he's giving the answer. But the letters are spelled out in such a way that it's quite easy to do. Certainly, dear Benjamin, we are still, Benjamin being the interlocutor, certainly, dear Benjamin, we are still far from being what we should be. So he admits that we need some repair. We need some reform. Again, I'll differentiate between reform, the movement, and the tikkun necessary for Judaism, by reform with a capital R for the movement, and reform with a lowercase for with the lowercase R for the repair, the tikkun that he's calling for. Let me just look in the chat for a second. Hold on a second. What? Tehillah, you asked about the translation of the Bible into German. Which translation of the Bible into German? You mean the Buber-Rosenzweig translation? Or oh, Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was in the Mendelssohn's Bible translation was done. Well, in other words, Mendelssohn was dead already, probably about 20 years or so before Mendelssohn died in the 1780s. Rav S.R. Hirsch was only born in 1808, so there's quite a few numbers of years. quite a few numbers of years. Again, Moses Mendelssohn was not a reformer. He was a maskil. He was the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, but not of the Reform movement. The Reform movement didn't get going until long after Moses Mendelssohn was dead. But I assume there's at least 50, if not more, years between Mendelssohn's translation of the Bible and this. Mendelssohn's accomplishment in that translation was less so the translation, because after all, the Bible, the Old Testament, was available in German translation. The greater innovation was the Beur, the commentary in German to the Chumash, written by Mendelssohn and his colleagues. Certainly written in German. Okay, now back to what we're talking about here. Certainly, dear Benjamin, we are still far from being what we should be. If you compare the ideal of life which the Torah desires us to realize, even according to the scanty outlines which I have drawn for you in these letters, with our actual life as individuals and as a community, you will at once discern how numerous are the steps we must still take, and how great a distance yet to be climbed before we can reach the glorious summit of our aspiration and our hope. Now, he doesn't spell out what that glorious summit of our aspiration and our hope are, but he's being very candid when he admits that the gap between the real and the ideal, the gap between Judaism as it ought to be and Judaism as it is a considerable gap. And he's very candid about that. As he says, listen, this is letter 17 of 19. This is the 17th essay I'm writing, spelling out the aspirations and ideals of Judaism and how it's compatible with life in the modern world, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he says, but you know what? You've got me there when you ask me, well, how come, you look around at Judaism as it's practiced and it falls short of those ideals. And he admits that's true, but that doesn't mean that the ideals are misplaced. It means that we need help in attaining them. Therefore, he says, let us indeed truly reform, in quotation marks, lowercase. Let us strive with all our power, with all the good and noble qualities of our character to reach this height and ideal perfection. Reform! We must reform. The Jewish people must be reformed, but not the halacha. Not the halacha. The only object of such reform, however, must be the fulfillment of Judaism by Jews in our time, the fulfillment of the eternal idea in harmony with the conditions set by the time. Now here, to our ears, we are so fortunate to be recipients of the accomplishments of those that have come before us. We don't appreciate, or we don't fully appreciate how completely radical this statement must have sounded when it was made in the middle of the 19th century. The fulfillment of the eternal idea of Judaism in harmony with the conditions set by the time. That there can be harmony between the surrounding modernity and the eternal ideas of Judaism. Sherry, you mentioned this sounds like a conservative movement. And to Hilalea, correct, you respond with the one exception, that halacha and modernity can exist in harmony. But he is not suggesting that halacha itself should be reformed in order to generate that harmony. He's advocating a belief that halacha as is, a divine system possessing integrity unto itself, itself can be harmonized with modernity. That there's nothing inherently disharmonious. There's nothing inherently disharmonious. But if something's going to have to give, it's going to have to be modernity, the conditions of the times. You know, these are ideas that, again, for us living in the modern world, again, I don't know, you know, I'm taking certain things for granted about our participants, and those of you that are with us. I mean, I can speak for myself. I consider myself a proud modern Orthodox Jew, and you know, but I'm fully aware that I live in a world where the path has already been paved by those that come before us. I often hear the, you know, the heroic voice. If this is not an exact quote, then certainly the sentiment is an exact quote of Rabbi Soloveitchik and of others, that we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear from the modern world. Judaism has nothing to fear from the modern world. Halakha has nothing to fear from the modern world. Science is not a threat. It's always shocking to me whenever the science and religion debate rears its head again and again. Most recently, probably in the debates around what's his name's books, you know, the zoo rabbi, Rabbi Slifkin, who wrote a number of books about science and Torah and evolution and Torah and etc. It's always shocking to me that there are still people that are interested in fighting that fight. To me, these things seem so. Again, I'm only speaking personally. It could be that that others disagree or feel differently on either side of the issue. To me, the idea that Judaism goes hand in hand with can go hand in hand with the best of science and philosophy and culture, etc., is right. You know, to me, this seems a given. And we were talking about Hirsch. Join us on Thursday nights when we study the Rambam together. The Rambam lived the full 600 years earlier, and you know, he was already a precursor even of that. The idea that modernity and Torah are not disharmonious, and in fact can be, whether it's harmonized or synthesized. I think I mentioned to you Rabbi Lamb's book, Torah Umada, where he spells out different models of interaction between the two components that reside on either side of that connector, Torah Umada or Torah in Derech Eretz, and of Shimshon Hirsch's phrase. But they all can be, you know, lined up in one way or another in the same stable. But the idea, which to us may seem so passé, is is here spelled out. It must be the education and progress of time to the high plane of the Torah, not the lowering of the Torah to the level of the age, cutting down the towering summit to the sunken grade of our own lives. So again, there's the cut. We Jews need to be reformed through Judaism itself. So there's the interesting thing. It's not Judaism that needs reform, it's Jews. Now, you know, I mean, if you know any Jews, spend any time with Jews, you know, you can see that there's still work to be done. We Jews need to be reformed through Judaism itself, newly comprehended by the spirit fulfillment of with the utmost energy, merely to seek greater ease and comfort in life through the destruction of the eternal code set up for all time by the God of eternity is not and never can be the reform which we need. So again, there's you know, spelling it out. The reform is not the destruction of the eternal code. The reform is not the chipping away at the halakha, which he points the accusing finger at the reform, capital R, the reform movement. That's not the reform we need. Judaism seeks to lift us up to its own high plane. we must never attempt to drag it down to our own level. I mean, this is just, I mean, as a writer, as a polemicist, I mean, the brilliance is just, it's just, 150 years later, we still, should stand in awe of his as a stylist. There you see the evil of our times. Ignorance or false views of Judaism combined with a tendency penetrating from the world outside into our humble habitations to look upon enjoyment as the chief aim of living. So there's the critique. There's the accusation of the motivation, the critique of the motivation or his perceived motivation of what's really driving the reform movement. It's this sense that we have to make it easier. It's the sense that we have to pull it down to us instead of trying to raise ourselves up to a higher standard. And this is done out of a sense of laziness, of a lack of imagination, a lack of commitment, a lack of energy, misplaced priorities. Alas, how widespread is the ignorance, how rare the Jew who knows himself, his purpose in life, and the meaning of his history. Where are the sons of Israel in whose breasts echo the tones of the harp of David and the words of the prophets, in whose minds, but I should be silent concerning the mind, sarcasm, comprehend the extent of Israel's duty. Again, here it is. It's an educational problem. It's an educational problem. Sherry, you pointed this out, correct. It's an educational problem. If you don't know the purpose of life and the meaning of our history, and if you don't have he's speaking very poetically. One imagines in the original German it was even stronger. You can read a translated sentence and know when it captures something, and when it's merely a pale reflection of what probably it is. But that sentence, where are the sons of Israel in whose breasts echo the tones of the harp of David and the words of the prophets, in whose minds comprehend the extent of Israel's duty? But parenthetically he says, but of course I should be silent concerning the mind, right? We can't talk about that. We can't, that's too much to say. Again, laced with sarcasm. And how many wrong and pernicious notions exist today concerning the principles, ordinances, teachings of Judaism? He says, look, if you don't understand it, if you don't comprehend what this system really is and what it really aspires to, so then obviously, why would anybody make that commitment to do the work of trying to climb up? It's hard work to scale the mountain. It's much easier to try to pull it down to us. So this is obvious, and it's certainly and tragically still true today. If somebody doesn't know and appreciate the ideals and the content and the aspirations of the Torah and of Judaism and of Halakha and of the committed religious lifestyle, it's unreasonable to expect them to make sacrifices on its behalf. Why should they? Why would they? And how many wrong and pernicious, even that which is known superficially, how little is known of its wondrously profound meaning. The Eidot duties, for example, let's translate this simply as the mitzvot. So useful and indispensable by virtue of the lessons they teach, are looked upon by some as mere mechanical opus operatum, or as amulet-like charms for the prevention of physical ailments or the erection of mystic supramundane worlds. So he says, people look at the performance of mitzvot. Let's assume we're talking not about the mitzvah ben adam lechavero, but the mitzvah ben adam lemakom. And people misunderstand them. Now, the Rambam says something very, very, very similar, particularly about mezuzah, example that he gives, about mezuzah. The people treat the mezuzah as some kind of voodoo charm. They turn it into an amulet. They turn it into something that's meant to ward off, the evil spirits from your home. And that's a complete interpretation, a completely misses the mark, says the Rambam, of what the mezuzah is supposed to do. I remember talking to some students once many years ago about davening and brachot and things of that nature. And there's a sense, even amongst students who lead a committed lifestyle, in the sense that they pray with regularity, they say brachot before or after they eat, but in terms of the larger purposes, of what the purposes of the mitzvot are, they're completely lacking. They're completely missing any deep sense and deep understanding of what the mitzvot are aiming at. Now, about this, we have to be careful. Ultimately, the reason that we perform mitzvot is because we are mitzuvim, because we are commanded. And the reason that God commanded us to do any particular thing is not necessarily clear to us. And in fact, certain mitzvot, it's Parshat Chukat this week. The theme of this week is that we do mitzvot because we are commanded, even though we may not have any idea whatsoever what the purpose of those mitzvot are. The para aduma being the chok, the mitzvah, the ritual, which we do because that's what God tells us to do, even though there is no insight that we could possibly have to His imagination to know how it works. But other mitzvot, the reasons seem a little more apparent. But even when the reasons are apparent, that does not mean that that's the reason that we do it. There were times when an argument was put forward that kashrut, for example, keeping kosher, it was for a health benefit. And there might be health benefits to keeping kosher, particularly in a time when there's no refrigeration or there are other sanitary issues that might be involved. There might be reasons why washing one's hands before eating have certain health benefits, etc. But that's not why we do it. And if the reasons change, if pork is just as healthy as beef, which may not have once been the case, that doesn't mean that we can now eat pork because the reason has disappeared. We have no idea what the reasons are. Ultimately, we surrender ourselves to God. Those that feel committed to the halachic system ultimately have to make that surrender and say, I am commanded and I perform the mitzvot because I am commanded, because I feel myself commanded. But, says Rav S.R. Hirsch, that's not completely enough. To perform the mitzvot out of rote or out of some immature sense of kind of forcing God's hand to micromanage God's actions in the world, that's improper. On these topics, I wrote something a couple of years ago called Spiritualizing Halachic Education, where I touch on some of these issues. I put a link to it. You can download the article from a website. It's a pretty lengthy piece, I think. It's about 84 pages or so. But you can download it there, and I touch on these larger topics there, particularly from the perspective of the Rambam, which again I think of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is is echoing. Now, interestingly, both the Rambam, particularly in the Mor Nevuchim, but also in the Mishnah Torah, as well as Shimshon Raphael Hirsch in his Torah commentary, as well as in his larger philosophical work, Chorev, spend a certain amount of energy in engaging in Ta'amei HaMitzvot, in the pursuit to try to understand philosophical, theological, sociological, historical reasons behind the mitzvot. Now, interestingly, of course, they both admit that you can't do this. And then they proceed to do precisely that. They say that the attempt to try to determine the ta'amei ha-mitzvot, the rationales behind the mitzvot, is ultimately futile, because we cannot comprehend the mystery of, ultimately we can't comprehend the mystery of God's will. But yet the attempt to try to understand within those limits is a worthwhile endeavor, as long as we do it with a certain amount of tzniut, a certain amount of reserve, a certain amount of modesty, when we admit that there's a level of speculation and that these reasons are not the ultimate reason that we perform mitzvot. That ultimate reason, of course, is the sense of being mitzvah. There were other schools of thought, by the way, it should be noted, that utterly rejected the whole Ta'amei HaMitzvot enterprise and saw it as being very dangerous, because, again, if we determine that mitzvah X is done for reason Y, and then conditions should change in such a way that reason Y is no longer relevant, well, then that obviously opens the door to say that mitzvah X is no longer applicable. This position was most famously articulated in the modern times by the Israeli religious philosopher Yeshaya Leibovitz, who was a brother to Nechama Leibovitz, the great Bible scholar, whose name I'm guessing might be more familiar to you. And Leibovitz said that any attempt to engage in this kind of Ta'amei HaMitzvot, this searching for the rationale of the mitzvot, is in and of itself avodah zarah. It's idolatry, because you end up worshiping yourself instead of worshiping God. And the only reason to perform a mitzvah is because you are mitzuveh. And any attempt to gain any insight or derive any benefit beyond that is in and of itself a form of idolatry, he argued, in a very sharp, harif line of reasoning, which is pretty much rejected by most people, because most people find meaning in the mitzvot, even if that meaning is not the reason that we perform the mitzvot. As for those highly important laws of Judaism, let's go back to Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. As to those highly important laws of Judaism, which strengthen us to do battle with the sensual lusts of appetite and passion, how little they are understood, how often denounced as cruel privation beyond the power of human nature to endure. So he points out that a lot of mitzvot seem to be an attempt to put a leash on our animalistic side. After all, mankind, humanity, is this bizarre hybrid between animals and angels. We're, physical beings just like the beasts of the field. We say it even in the Yom Kippur davening, Moser ha'odam min ha'bahema ayin. The value added of a man above the beasts is as nothing. On one hand, we're just like the beasts of the field. We need to be fed. We need shelter, clothing. We need to mate. We have the most base instincts. On the other hand, we're endowed with Tzelem Elokim. We're created in the image of God. We've been given the ability to think, to use our rational capabilities, the power of speech, which Rashi says is really the Tzelem Elokim. Rashi says the way that we're godlike is that we have speech. Speech, perhaps, being the embodiment of our rational capacities, or the siman, the indicator of our rational facilities. And we're commanded to be like the angels. We're commanded to be partners with God in creation. There's a real paradox there. So there are many mitzvot which appear to be, again, be careful. I was careful to use the term appear to be. There are many mitzvot that obviously seem to be an attempt to curb, to train, to funnel the animalistic component of our nature. We want to eat. We're hungry, we want to eat. God says you want to eat b'te'avon, but you can't eat everything. And you can't eat whenever you want. And if you eat this, you have to wait a certain amount of time before you eat that. And there are certain days you can't eat at all. And there are certain things you can never eat. And there are certain things, before you want to eat them, they have to be prepared in a certain way. The animal has to be slaughtered in a certain way. The blood has to be removed, etc., etc., etc. You want to eat, that's fine. Before you eat, Chazal say, make a bracha. Pause and make a declaration that the food you're about to eat ultimately comes from God. You're done eating, thank Him for what you've received. The whole framework is meant to curb the sensual lusts of appetite, which might say, you're hungry, go out, rip off the leg of a cow and chomp away. Man has, let's speak about it in a tsanua way, but mankind has a need to reproduce, has a need to mate, has a physiological need, has an emotional need, has a social need. God says that's fine. But what? We're not like the Catholic Church. We don't see sexual relations as the primal sin. We don't see that desire as inherently polluting or impure. But it's an extraordinarily powerful drive. It's an extraordinarily powerful impulse. And it needs to be checked, and it needs to be tamed. And therefore, intimate relations between a man and a wife have to be limited, between man and wife, and have to be sanctified with the laws of family purity. Tarat HaMishpacha. I trust that you understand what it is that I'm referring to. These are just two of the stronger examples. So Rav S.R. says that people that don't understand the nature of these mitzvot, they point to it as cruel privation beyond the power of human nature to endure. They say, well, this is crazy. This is crazy. Who could live like this? Who could live like this? Depriving themselves of their needs, instead of seeing it as an attempt to sanctify, human needs and drives, and to tame them and to not negate them. That's the problem of the Catholic Church, and unfortunately they're suffering from it terribly. I think that it's pretty clear that some of the terrible abuses, to be clear, parenthetically, let me state, let's be clear, Judaism and Jewish community and rabbis are not inherently immunized against all types of terrible sexual misdeeds, but I think that the idea that sex is viewed as something inherently, an inherent weakness, an inherent flaw, an inherent sin, or whether you look at it as something very holy, but very powerful, with the potential for getting out of control, is a complete 180-degree difference in orientation. Judaism, generally speaking, does not favor the ascetic lifestyle. Does not favor the ascetic lifestyle. It's true that the Torah has the notion of the Nazir, I won't go into the for time. I won't go into the details of this. If you have questions, I'll be happy to speak with you afterwards. But TLA is correct. When a Nazir is done with his period of Nizirut, of separating himself from certain pleasures of the world, he has to bring in a sin offering, because there's something, even though there's a mitzvah to do this for certain people, but there's something inherently problematic with it. And in general, the Torah does not favor the ascetic lifestyle. And although there have been certain ascetic impulses in different periods in Jewish history, those are really the exceptions to the mainstream Jewish worldview. Hirsch goes on, the inner concept, the comprehension of Judaism, of the significance of its historic mission and teachings, is lacking, and therefore love for it has no soil upon which to grow. The champions of contemporary reform sincerely desire the welfare of Israel. This is also a very candid admission. He says the people behind the reform movement, their intentions are good. They're not evil people. They're misguided people. Their followers are lacking in education and understanding. But they're not trying to destroy Judaism. They're just going about it in the wrong way, and it's going to have really bad effects. The champions of contemporary reform sincerely desire the welfare of Israel. And if they have failed to recognize the good and have erred in their comprehension of the truth, it is not they who are chiefly to blame, and even more radical. The entire past bears the responsibility together with them, meaning this aggregate of lack of deep understanding about what this whole project of halachic Judaism is about. That's to blame. You should therefore respect their good intentions. You may well weep and mourn when you examine the aims to which their efforts are directed. Tila, I don't understand your question. No, so in other words, there are all different types of reasons. There are all different types of reasons why the past has gotten us to this point where people don't, really understand. This lack of understanding is the root of the problem. This educational flaw is the lack. Why is there an educational flaw? So there's all types of reasons. The history of anti-Semitism certainly made it that it was difficult to do the hard work of living a rich life. Even if you were committed to the observance of mitzvot, Rav Hirsch is making an argument that's not enough. The rote performance is not enough. Hard as that is, everybody needs to be a little religious philosopher. It's not enough to shake a lulav or to put on tefillin or to bench after you eat, rather. You need to be thinking about you need to be engaged in a spiritual, intellectual process, which is hard to do. It's hard to do for all types of reasons. It's hard to do if you're getting beaten up by the Cossacks. It's hard to be a philosopher when you're hungry, right? And a lot of people were hungry. It's just hard to maintain that level. To say nothing of the fact that not everyone is cut out for it. Like the Rambam, or the critique on the Rambam, we can make a similar critique on Rav Hirsch, that it's expecting a lot of people. And after all, if you look at a whole community, no more than 50% are going to be of above average intelligence, by definition. And it's asking a lot of people. To take a standpoint somewhere outside of Judaism, to accept a conception derived from strangers, you know what? I had hoped to finish this all tonight. Maybe we should spend another week looking at this, and maybe at one other little piece from Rav Hirsch. It might be worthwhile. I see our time is up. So why don't we pause here, and we'll continue with this next week, assuming people are interested in doing that. We've spent a little more time on Rav Hirsch than I anticipated, but we'll continue with